Welcome back to The Negotiators, a production of Doha Debates and Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Jen Williams. This is episode 4 of our special series, The Afghan Impasse, exploring 20 years of failed attempts to negotiate a peace deal in Afghanistan. If you haven't started with episode 1, we recommend that you go back and do that now. In this episode, we're going to hear from reporter Ali Latifi. Ali is the Asia editor at the New Humanitarian. He's been reporting from Kabul since 2001, and he stayed behind after the withdrawal of U.S. troops in August of 2021 to report on what was happening on the ground.
Ali Latifi, let's begin with you. You are in Kabul. Describe
Ali Latifi. We reached him on the phone in Kabul after he had gone.
Ali, the Taliban promised a more moderate rule, but the interim government...
We asked Ali to tell us about the failed negotiations that led directly to the return of the Taliban. And for Ali, this story is personal. He was born in Kabul, and he grew up in California's Bay Area in a neighborhood of Afghan Americans that's often called Little Kabul. Ali reported from Afghanistan for all 7 years of Afghan President Ashraf Ghani's administration, and he came to know its inner workings. The Ghani administration has been widely accused of corruption by both Afghan and U.S. officials. And I think we have to say this, Ali was already skeptical of the Ghani administration before we asked him to look into these negotiations. But after talking directly with the people involved, his concerns only became larger.
I was angry. I was really angry because I felt like you had this opportunity. You could have done something for your country. This didn't have to end this way.
Here's Ali Latifi with The Afghan Impasse, Episode 4, History Repeats. I want to start where our last episode left off, and that's with the signing of the Doha Agreement on February 29th, 2020. Where was Afghan President Ashraf Ghani? Where were you? Just set the scene for me.
Ashraf Ghani was somewhere in the palace. There was a big event. He was there. Dr. Abdullah, who was head of the reconciliation, he was there. Other major leaders were there. There were U.S. generals there. And yeah, they were all standing there looking, staring at the screen, watching the signing live. There seemed to be no objection. There seemed to be no discord, nothing. It just seemed like another formal government event. I was at home in Kabul. I had all kinds of radio and TV interviews that day, but I don't think any of us knew what it would turn into. There were so many false starts to the point where in 2015, I remember we were in the palace, all of us journalists working for foreign media outlets. I was working for the Los Angeles Times. The president invited us all for a meeting, for a briefing, and he had said that he had sent a team to Pakistan to start the process of some kind of talks. And sitting at this table in the palace, in my head, I was like, naive, like, oh my God, what if this really leads to peace? What if I'm actually here for history? What if things really change? Because you have to remember, from my generation on, we were all basically born into war, right?
Right.
I'll never forget the first time my mother came back in 2013. She said to me, she was like, Ali, you were born in this country in war. You left it in war. You came back in war, and you'll leave it again in war. So to me, the thought of an actual peace just seemed improbable, but also enticing, right? Maybe everyone will come back now. Maybe things will get better. As soon as we got out of the meeting, we were all standing there, and all my other friends, all the other Afghan journalists just started laughing, oh God, he's wasting our time again. What is this now about? It was just like a balloon that just deflated right away.
So you have the 2015 moment where you're actually kind of hopeful, and then you realize, oh, maybe I'm being naive because everyone else is laughing at this. And okay. So then 2020 happens, Did you have that feeling again, or was it this time you were one of the ones laughing too?
I don't know if I was laughing. I wanted it to be true.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to make a difference. But the difference this time was I knew the Afghan government very well.
Yeah.
I knew how corrupt they were. I knew how selfish they were.
Mhm.
I knew how little they cared about the country and the people. I knew how many of them had foreign passports and were constantly talking about being from somewhere else. So I had even less faith in them than I did the Americans or the Taliban
Wow.
because I knew them.
Yeah.
I didn't really know the Karzai government. I barely knew Hamid Karzai.
Sure.
But I knew the Ashraf Ghani government very, very well. And I saw just how despicable they were. It became very clear that people were lying to him, were keeping information from him. If you're not telling the leader the truth, how is he going to make the proper decision? Even if he has the best intentions, how is he going to make the proper decision?
So there's this Doha Agreement signing the very next day.
In less than 24 hours, President Ashraf Ghani went from praising the agreement to now saying that he refused certain aspects.
The president of Afghanistan is against freeing thousands of Taliban prisoners.
That was supposed to pave the way for direct talks between the two sides, but President Ghani has said the swap cannot be a precondition for intra-Afghan peace talks.
Ghani says,
Right.
I'm not going to release the Taliban prisoners. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, of course it surprised me. He knew what was in that agreement. He stood there happily watching it being signed. He could have said that on February 28th or 29th. He didn't need to say it on March 1st. I knew that the people around him would find a way to twist his hand and to have him derail the whole thing.
You spoke with an Afghan American journalist named Akal Dawi, and he told you that he felt from the beginning that there were elements within the Republic who were deliberately trying to spoil the process. Before we get to how he came to that conclusion, can you tell me who Akmal is and how he first got involved in the negotiations?
So Akmal is a Voice of America journalist. He's an Afghan American. He's lived in the United States for pretty sure like more than a decade now. And he was approached by officials in the Department of State to help translate in these Doha negotiations.
And sure enough, I found myself in Ritz-Carlton Hotel where Ambassador Khalilzad was leading an interagency delegation of U.S. officials about to enter this historic, secretive talks with the Taliban on the way forward.
I mean, I don't think he ever would have imagined that he would be sitting with a Talib and, dressed however he wanted to be dressed,
Right.
being able to discuss his experiences both of the Civil War and of the Taliban times and have them listen to him at the very least.
I remember one time over lunch, there was a mixed group of Americans and the Taliban, and we talked about our bitter history, our civil war in Afghanistan in the 90s. And I spoke about a terrible experience we had when the rockets were landing and there was fighting and there were so many brutalities and we had no future and there was no food, extreme poverty. And at what time I looked at the Taliban's delegate and she was crying. And that I was so shocked. I said, I'm sorry. She said, no. Do you think we're not human, we Taliban? Do you think we don't feel the pain? Do you think we don't have families, relatives? My son died in those conflicts. We belong to the same land. We've suffered too.
To see that like the one thing that unfortunately unites every Afghan over the last 40, 50 years are the losses and the traumas of all of these wars, of all of these conflicts. And of course, I mean, even today, I can't imagine myself like sitting, with a Taliban minister and like, having a meal. So I couldn't imagine it, in 2018.
So yeah, I can imagine that, like having the meal, having chai, like actually having the conversations. That it's something we talk about a lot on this show too, is that like seeing the other side as humans, right? Like
and that's very
as people.
important.
Yeah.
That's very important because during like the 20 years of the occupation, like they were literally radio and TV commercials like, oh, the Talibs are murderers, they're evil, they
Right.
blow up schools, they burn masjids, they do this, they do that. And then at the same time, the Taliban were feeding into their people, these people are all heathens, right?
Right.
They've all lost their way, they're not Afghan, they're not Muslim, they're nothing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because, yeah, I mean, it makes sense on one side to say, like, oh, we see the Taliban as monsters. And so now I want to humanize them. But that's right. Like, the Taliban had to humanize everyone else.
Yeah. They had to realize that there's 30 million people who were a victim to the occupation and to them.
So as I said, Akmal, he felt from the beginning that there were elements within the Republic who were trying to spoil the process. Can you tell me what specifically brought him to that conclusion?
Part of it was knowing the people within the government.
Right, like you said.
And the other part was sort of hearing about what was happening in Kabul, right? Because this is the thing, even during the Republic in 2014, when John Kerry essentially came and settled the disputed election and created this national unity government, there was all this infighting about, who sits where in cabinet meetings. And, like Dr. Abdullah sent a memo to the entire government that you have to address me as the Honorable Dr. Abdullah. And, I don't understand how this solves it, but they said in the cabinet meetings, they had to build a special square table so that neither Dr. Abdullah nor President Ghani were seen as the head of the table.
Right.
And then also knowing that there was already infighting, even more so than between the Abdullah and Ghani camps, within the Ghani camp itself. Yes, they all campaigned for him, but then they all divided into sub-camps and were all trying to sabotage each other.
I think that's so important. I think that's something that Americans really don't understand about this negotiation in particular.
Also because it's unexpected, right? You would never imagine a presidential administration to be fighting to that level amongst each other.
So I imagine watching that, it's just, of course, that he gets that idea of okay, this isn't going to go anywhere.
It took a very long time for President Ghani to build a team of Afghan delegates and send them over to Doha. Initially, they had a team of 80 people they wanted to send. And then the Taliban said, this is so imbalanced. We don't have 80 people to have them sit with. They are so disorganized. They are so divided. If they cannot form a delegation to come to Doha and talk with us, how are they gonna, make a government?
Was the Taliban acting relatively cohesively at that point?
That's what shocked everybody. I spoke to Akmal. We also spoke to Fatima Gyani, who was one of the negotiators, and they both said that both during the intra-Afghan talks and during the talks with the US, the Taliban were very clear. They had essentially a piece of paper with a few points every day. Mainly one person talked, and they stuck to a script. That was precisely what shocked people, that these people that, again, were billed as these murderers, as these quote-unquote backwards cave people, and all of this, were actually, very orderly and on point and on topic. And again, it's interesting because in a lot of ways, they were a disparate group, because sure, they had central leadership, but then they also had so many ground forces all over the country who didn't necessarily always follow the edicts. The fact that they were able to, in this political capacity, stick to a script. Because again, look, these Republic people couldn't do that.
Meanwhile, the Taliban's we've got our talking points.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Akmal described the trouble that the Republic had choosing a reasonable number of delegates. And then they look at the people on the list. Were they the people who were actually positioned to represent the people of Afghanistan?
The frustration of the people with the government side was that it was quite obvious that these were political appointees. They weren't people who necessarily knew how to make peace. They weren't necessarily people who fully understood how to debate religiously with the Taliban, even maybe culturally. They were just political appointees. If you couldn't make them ambassador, if you couldn't make them minister, then you would just send them to Doha for however long, stay in a resort, and get to say that they were part of this process,
rather than they are a qualified negotiator who is good at negotiating.
Exactly. Or that these are people who are actually respected amongst the Afghan people. Because you have to remember, you had the children of warlords. Their families profited from war and death and destruction, and their children never understood the life of an average Afghan man or woman their age.
Yeah.
And that really offended people, because they were like, these people, they're the legacy of war. And now they're profiting again.
You're listening to the Afghan Impasse, a special 7-episode season of The Negotiators from Doha Debates and Foreign Policy. So the intra-Afghan peace talks finally begin on September 12th, 2020. This is more than 6 months after the Doha Agreement was signed. But not much was accomplished. Tell me why not.
From my understanding, it was just constantly talks about talks. You know, in the beginning, they were talking about, we have to organize the framework of how we're going to talk and the timeline. And I don't know if this was due to ego or a stalling technique or both. And they kept saying, we've made good progress. Like months would go by and they'd be like, we've made good progress on that.
On the structure of how we're eventually going to talk.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, just get to the talking. You know, you're in this resort together. Like, just get to the talking.
And that's so interesting because I've talked to, obviously, this is our 4th season of the show, and I've talked to a lot of, professional negotiators, and several of them have said that diplomacy is process. Figuring out what are the terms, what is the framework, like how many on your side gets to come, how many on our side. But at a certain point, we're just being ridiculous. Like now it's just become an impediment.
Here's the thing, right? Okay, I could see why diplomacy between Washington and the Taliban would be a lot of process.
Mm-hmm.
But theoretically, these are both Afghan sides. So how do they not know how to speak to one another?
Yeah.
Like the Afghan people have been negotiating with each other and having, jirgas and shuras and so on. And even like within villages and districts, like discussions with each other, trying to sort these things out. If you're really Afghan, you should know how to do this.
So Zalmay Khalilzad, the American diplomat who had negotiated the Doha Agreement, he told us that part of the problem was semantics.
One way out is to agree on a power sharing, which would be a new government. But President Ghani, he didn't like the word new, because he thought that the right thing to do would be for the Talibs to join him. And the Talibs would not consider that, because they say that would show that they only fought for power.
So you're dealing with two obstinate sides. And to be fair, I don't understand how it could have been a continuation of the old government anyway.
Right.
Because the old government itself didn't like the old government and get along with each other. So I don't understand why they wanted to keep a broken system going.
We also, as you mentioned, we spoke to Fatima Gyani, one of the negotiators for the Republic. What did she have to say about how Ghani was approaching the negotiations?
Exactly what everybody thought, that he had no plan.
What we lacked was a guidance, a leadership which should come from our country, that these are your limits, these are the chips that you can wheel and deal and negotiate upon.
She said, like, I don't even know what my red lines are.
Wow.
I know what my personal red lines are, but I don't know what the government's red lines are. I don't know what is negotiable as an overall strategy and what isn't. Personally, yes, I know. But as a representative of a government, no. She said there was more order, again, see what I mean by political appointments, by those who were appointed by Dr. Abdullah. She said they were more in contact with Dr. Abdullah. Again, they're the same government.
Right.
And yet there were people who you knew were clearly appointed by Dr. Abdullah and those that were clearly appointed by President Ghani. And they went in with that mentality. And she felt like they weren't being given the support from Kabul.
Everything was blocked by the presidential office. Every way was blocked by him. I mean, the international community, they were expressing this worry that President Ghani is not very serious about this talk. Even if he's serious, he wants an opposite outcome out of it.
You also spoke to Abdul Salim Ziv. He's a former Taliban diplomat who spent years in Guantanamo. And he told you that he was working behind the scenes to try to bring the sides together. Tell me, what did that look like?
In Guantanamo, there were, according to him, people who were either directly part of the U.S. government or somehow, were tied enough to them, who would approach him and kind of talk to him the way you would as an Afghan to an elder. So he used basically the fact that he knew all of the sides to try and ensure that there were actually some kind of talks.
And Zaif said he even called President Ghani? What did...
He went to see him.
Oh, he went to see him. So
he went to see him in the final months of the Republic, and he said, you have to take this seriously. I'm telling you right now, you have to take this seriously.
I wanted to convince him not to ruin the peace process. His belief was that if the Taliban are not accepting others, they should at least accept me as the president, and I should remain in power.
Mullah Zaif told him, he said, that's impossible. That's never going to happen.
I responded, if you want the Taliban to officially recognize you, even for 1 minute, it is impossible. Discard that thought, because recognizing you means recognizing the Republic, the occupation, your laws, and your bilateral agreements with the US. The Taliban are not foolish. Erase that idea from your mind. If you desire peace in Afghanistan, you have to make sacrifices.
You have to make that sacrifice. You have to give up this position for 30-something million people.
And he wouldn't.
He didn't want to do it.
Around this time, there was also a presidential election in the United States, right? So pretty much the only thing that the two candidates seemed to agree on was that the U.S. should get out of Afghanistan. But still, the negotiations stagnated until after the inauguration. Why? What happened there?
Because they were hoping that Biden would be more amenable to staying, which is ironic because anybody who's paid attention to Biden over the last 20 years knew that he hated this war. But I mean, I was talking to people within the government at the time, and they were saying oh, we're just going to wait out the election. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. Trump is crazy. At first, they loved Trump. At first, they were like, oh, this is great. This guy's a war hawk. He's going to continue the war, and, we're going to be fine. And then, obviously, Trump made it very clear at a certain point that I'm done. I'm out. And then they were hedging all their bets on Biden. And then, we saw how that ended.
Right. So I want to talk about that. On April 14th, 2021, now President Joe Biden announced the unconditional withdrawal of U.S. troops. How did people in Kabul respond to that announcement?
So this is what I want to say. The people of Afghanistan, by and large, had been sick of this occupation since I first went back in 2011, right? At that point, they were already over it. The average people. I'm not talking about the ones who profited off of the war, but the average people.
Sure.
By 2021, they were completely sick of it. But what everybody was angry at was the unconditional part. The fact that he put no pressure on either side to take the negotiation seriously. That he put no pressure on the Taliban to enact an actual ceasefire. That's what angered people. They had no problem with the U.S. leaving. What they had a problem with was you're leaving us in the hands of either a corrupt government or our would-be murderers without any sort of restrictions or guidelines or conditions on them. Not only that, but you pay the government's bills. Every single member of that government, the reason they have a salary is because of you.
You have leverage.
You have the most leverage.
Yeah.
And you also have leverage with the Taliban in that you signed an agreement with them and you can say, hey, I signed this agreement, but this agreement says X, Y, and Z, and you haven't abided by it. And the fact that that didn't take place is what angered and scared people.
We also spoke to Hekmat Karzai, who was deputy foreign minister under Ashraf Ghani. He told us that in the spring of 2021, during the holy month of Ramadan, the Taliban made an official offer to share power.
Let us adopt the 1964 constitution. We will take the lead and we will have a joint government. This was a constitution that I think would have allowed so many things. I mean, it would have allowed us to keep our institutions, to keep our values, to keep our flag, and so many things. And I came back to Kabul and I raised that issue. Officially, it was also raised within the negotiation team and the negotiation teams to the Afghan government. Yet the leadership at the Afghan government just dismissed it, saying, oh, we have our own constitution. It was mostly dismissed by Ghani because he was under the assumption that he still had leverage, but he did not have leverage.
Karzai felt like this could have been a real opportunity. Do you agree?
Of course it could have. You know, in the interview with Akal Dawi, he said that, you know, some Talib official, I can't remember which one, had essentially said to him, you know, like, we want to set it up so that people like you come back and become deputy minister and that you can lead things. We know that we don't have the capacity and we don't necessarily want to be running offices and ministries and whatnot. Definitely not by ourselves, if at all. So it would have given people a lot of hope because it probably would have seemed like a middle road. You know, maybe the Taliban could have helped bring down some of the corruption that the Republic was so known for. And maybe the former Republic people could sort of mitigate against some of the very extreme views of the Taliban.
So many just missed opportunities.
Yeah. And, you know, the question is, how did it fall apart? Why did it fall apart? The US was still bankrolling the Republic. So why didn't they put pressure on both sides to be like, hey, this is the best either side is going to get? I think these are all questions that people have, that all sides failed.
Zalai Khalilzad told us that the U.S. hoped that the Afghan forces would perform better during the withdrawal.
We thought that given the number of troops, 300,000 plus, the weapons, the training, that if the government could demonstrate that it can defend itself, fight effectively, then maybe the Talibs would take them more seriously and negotiate more seriously.
Very obviously not what happened. Tell me about that. What do you think about that?
I'm sure they did think that, but it was unrealistic. I am someone who had been all across that country, had seen the situation of the soldiers and the police and security forces. And, you know, in 2020, if I remember correctly, I went to Logar province, which is about 40 minutes south of Kabul. And at that time was one of the least safe provinces in all of Kabul. I was staying with the governor at the time. In his own compound, there were soldiers that had not been paid for 6 months in one of the least secure provinces in the country.
Wow.
You know, they said, we don't have new shoes. We don't even have like walkie-talkies. We don't have enough bullets. We don't have enough guns. If you're not being paid and you're not given the equipment that you need, plus you hear reports that they're killing civilians too, plus you don't see, especially outside the major cities, you don't see any real development. You keep hearing stories about fraudulent elections and about corrupt officials and all. What are you fighting for?
Right. And I do want to say, like, in their defense, like, there were plenty who did fight very hard.
But that's what I'm saying. They fought despite the challenges.
Yeah.
Despite the challenges, they fought. They tried.
American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
This idea that they wouldn't fight for their country, I think, is kind of outrageous. 60 or 70.
I'm talking north of 50, 60, 70,000 have died fighting for their country, dying fighting the Taliban. Now,
if you don't have enough supplies, you don't have enough ammunition, you haven't seen your family, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And again, like, I was absolutely despicable of the Americans to say that, but it was also despicable of the government, the Kabul government, to put these guys in that situation.
Right. Because the money was flowing in, right? Like, the money for the boots was there. It just wasn't going to where it was supposed to go.
Exactly.
Well, we have two eyewitnesses confirming that the city of Zaranj in southwestern Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban.
So on August 6th, 2021, Nimroz falls.
And that would be the first provincial capital to be in the Taliban's hands.
What was the response from the Republic?
Silence. Absolute silence. And this is what, to this day, I'm still so upset at. So before that, the spokesman for the Ministry of Defense suddenly got really good with me. And any question I would ask him, he would answer. If I needed help arranging something, no problem. Very open, responsive on WhatsApp, everything. That man disappeared. Messages, calls, whatever, just the man didn't exist.
Wow.
It was so night and day. It was like a switch.
So what was the mood like in the country? I mean, especially as the Talibs get closer and closer to Kabul, what was the mood in the city? Panic?
Panic.
Yeah.
You know, when Nimroz and Farah fell, people were like, okay, they're far off and they weren't very well managed anyways. And maybe they'll get it back at a certain point, you know, but then every day.
Yeah.
I mean, there were days where like 3 would fall, and it was terror. It was fear. It was this creeping sense, you know, that something big was about to happen, you know? Imagine 34 provinces fall and the entire time nobody says anything. There is no television address. There is no statement. There's nothing. There's no apology. There's no promise that, don't worry, we'll get it back.
God, that must have been terrifying.
Yeah. Especially once the provinces started to fall, to see that nobody really said, we have to apply pressure to both of these sides. I recently talked to someone in like the U.S. diplomatic corps. I brought this point up and they had said, oh, well, you know, there was no way we weren't going to like send any more soldiers. And I said, no one wanted that. No one needed that. All you had to do was like exert your force at a negotiating table.
Do you think the Biden administration just thought they had more time, or did they just straight up just wash their hands of it?
I think they washed their hands of it. Because if this is the thing, is like if you followed Joe Biden's career, especially in relation to Afghanistan, he had no interest in the country, and he still has no interest in the country. The day of August 15th, there were all these rumors that certain former officials who were abroad would come back, and Hamid Karzai and Dr. Abdullah would also be there, and there would be some kind of a joint government. There were all these proposed cabinet lists that were being sent around that gave people some level of hope that, okay, at least they could try and mitigate a little bit of the extreme ways of the Taliban and bring in some of that knowledge, you know, from day one.
So then that same day, August 15th, just 9 days after the fall of Nimroz, President Ashraf Ghani climbs aboard a helicopter and flees the country. How did you hear that he was gone?
So again, like I said, I knew people who were very close to him. And one of them, who was leaving that day herself, called me and she said, oh, I'm going to head to the airport. And I remember I joked with her. I said, so when is Ghani leaving? She's like, he's not leaving, Ali. Why would he leave? And then around 4 or 5 p.m. Kabul time, the news came that Ghani had fled.
Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani has gone. He's left the country.
In a social media post, Ghani explained he left to avoid bloodshed.
The Afghan government had been negotiating with the Taliban for a political settlement, but its leverage had weakened with every loss on the battlefield.
Everybody was angry. People assumed he would flee, but I guess no one imagined it in the way it happened.
So Fatima was in Doha, preparing for another round of talks when she heard the news. What do you know about what that was like for members of the negotiating team when that happened? Like, they're there literally getting ready to do what they think are negotiations.
Based on the way she described it, at first they're like, wait, who? What? Like, who fled? What happened?
No one believed that this man would run away. No one. That was a time of extreme disappointment. A leader who abandons, a leader who just hours before went on television and said that I will never leave you alone. This was a huge shock for all of us.
They were the representatives of his government that were meant to figure out what to do.
Right.
What were they going to do in Doha? Like, what were they going to say to these guys? You know, what would these guys think? Like, oh, your leader fled?
That's a bit awkward.
He sent you here. He ran away and he didn't tell you? I think it was just shock and disbelief and anger and frustration. And I think also a sense of confirmation of what they suspected all along, that They never had an intention to create peace.
Before I let Ali go, I wanted to ask him to talk a little bit more about U.S. Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. We've heard from him throughout this series. He was born and raised in Afghanistan, but he's now very much an American, and he's been working in the U.S. government and representing the U.S. abroad since the 1980s. He's also the man who negotiated the Doha Agreement on behalf of the United States. So I wanted to know, how is he seen by Afghans?
Smarmy, sly, very slick, kind of like a used car salesman, like the cliche of a used car salesman. Khalilzad was never seen as a reliable, truthful, honorable figure. Him allying himself with Trump also angered people. Him then becoming the chief negotiator and, by a lot of people's views, sort of a proxy for the Taliban also angered people.
So, once the Doha Agreement was signed, how did people's perspective of Khalilzad change? Did it change?
No, I think it confirmed it.
In our next episode, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of pushing forward with the story, we're going to go back and look at it again, from the perspective of just one man, Zalmay Khalilzad.
I know there is always a lot of attention to the agreement, to the Doha Agreement, but not to the fact that there's two presidents from two parties to say, we don't believe this is working. We want to leave.
And we're going to ask the really tough question.
The accusation is that you sold out Afghanistan.
No, it isn't what some people allege or charge.
That's next time on the Afghan Impasse from the Negotiators. The Negotiators is a podcast from Doha Debates and Foreign Policy. This episode was reported by Ali Latifi. Karen Given is this season's executive producer. Original music written by Afghan composer Arsan Fahim and performed by Arsan Fahim and Afghan rubab player Sadiq Ahmed. Our production team includes Laura Rosbrow-Telem, Rob Sachs, Rosie Julin, Claudia Tatey, Jafet Weeks, Jigar Mehta, Amjad Atala, and Dan Efron. Thanks to Nelafar Hidayat, Govinda Clayton, and James Wally for helping create the show. Foreign Policy is a magazine of news and ideas from around the world. We encourage you to subscribe at foreignpolicy.com/subscribe. Doha Debates is a production of Qatar Foundation, where the most urgent issues of our time are discussed and debated. Learn more at dohadebates.com.